The house was quiet that morning, too quiet for a home with children. Then it happened, a sound so small and gentle that it almost didn't seem real. "Mommy." David Coleman stopped at the doorway, his hand still holding his briefcase, his body frozen in place. The sound came again, soft and shaky, breaking through the silence that had lived in that mansion for years. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. But when he looked inside the room, his world stopped completely. His twin boys, Ethan and Noah, who had never spoken a single word since birth, were sitting on the floor, their eyes fixed on the maid. And there she was, Grace Miller, the quiet woman he barely noticed, kneeling before them in her black and white uniform, her yellow gloves still on. Her hands stretched toward the boys as she whispered with a trembling voice, "It's okay, baby, I'm here." Then the word came again, "Mommy." This time, it was clearer, stronger, and it didn't come from just one child, but both. David's chest tightened, his throat dry, his mind refusing to believe what his ears just heard. For 2 long years, he had spent millions on hospitals, machines, and experts who said his sons would never speak. But now, right in his own house, the impossible was happening. And it was the maid who made it happen. He wanted to step inside, to speak, to ask what was going on, but he couldn't move. His legs felt weak, his heart heavy. He just stood there watching, every breath slow and shaky. Grace didn't see him. Her full attention was on the twins. She spoke softly, like a mother calming her children after a storm. "Say it again, sweetheart. I'm listening," she whispered. The boys looked at her with trembling lips. Their eyes glowed with something David had not seen before, life. He had seen doctors push buttons, nurses take notes, and machines hum for hours, but he had never seen his sons look at anyone that way. It was as if they recognized her voice, as if it reached some hidden place that no medicine ever could. David took one slow step backward, his breath shaking. The briefcase slipped from his hand and landed gently on the floor. He didn't pick it up. He turned away from the door quietly, closing it behind him. The word "mommy" echoed in his head as he walked down the long hallway. The marble floor was cold under his shoes. The walls around him were white and tall, lined with portraits of people who once smiled, but not anymore. Everything in that house looked perfect, but nothing in it felt alive. He stopped in front of the window at the end of the hallway and looked outside. The morning sun sat above the Texas sky, lighting up the garden that was built for joy but never used. The grass had no footprints. The swings never moved. The sandbox was still clean from the day it was built. It used to be different when Sarah was alive. She would run barefoot across that same lawn, laughing as the wind pulled her hair. She had dreamed of hearing the twins giggle, of teaching them to talk, to walk, to live. But life had other plans. She never made it back home after giving birth. That was the day the laughter in his house died. Since then, David had tried to fill the emptiness with rules, money, and order. Everything had to be clean, quiet, and under control. But silence had a way of becoming louder when you tried to fight it. Now, that same silence had been broken by one word, spoken by the children who were never supposed to speak. He entered his office and closed the door behind him. The room smelled of books and paper. He sat down slowly, his hands shaking as he rubbed his face. "What did I just see?" he whispered to himself. He had paid for every kind of help science could offer. Neurologists, speech therapists, special equipment, and endless tests. None of it had worked. Yet somehow, this young maid had done in 3 weeks what the experts could not do in 2 years. Grace Miller. He barely knew anything about her. She had come from Dallas. The agency said she was calm, polite, and hardworking. Nothing special. Just another quiet worker who stayed out of the way. But now she was the one person his sons had called Mommy. The thought made his chest ache. That word wasn't just a sound. It was a piece of his past, a voice he thought he'd never hear again. For a moment, he could almost see Sarah in that nursery, humming like she used to when she was pregnant, whispering soft promises to their unborn sons. He took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. Maybe it wasn't real, he told himself. Maybe the boys had made random sounds and his tired mind turned it into a word. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had heard it too clearly. He looked at the clock on the wall. Only 30 minutes had passed, but it felt like a lifetime. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the same word again. He tossed and turned, remembering every doctor who had told him there was no hope, every test result that said his sons would never speak, and now that single fragile word had undone everything he believed. At midnight, he got out of bed and walked through the dark hallway. The lights from outside cast faint shadows across the floor. He passed the portraits again, their painted faces cold and empty. He stopped near the nursery door. The room was dark except for a small lamp glowing near the crib. He looked in quietly. Grace was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, both boys asleep beside her. One of them twitched in his sleep, and she reached out to cover him gently with a blanket. Her movements were slow, careful, filled with care. She didn't look up, didn't notice him. She was humming softly, a tune that seemed familiar. David felt something heavy rise in his throat. He hadn't heard a song in that house for years. Not since Sarah. He stayed there, standing in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid to break that quiet peace. For the first time in a long while, the silence in his house didn't feel empty. It felt alive. He turned away slowly and walked back to his room. When he lay down, his eyes stayed open for hours. The sound of her humming stayed with him. The word "mommy" played again and again in his mind. And as he drifted toward sleep, one thought refused to leave him. Tomorrow, he would talk to Grace. He needed to know what she had done, how she had done it, and why his sons had spoken for her when they had never spoken for anyone else. He didn't know it yet. But the truth waiting for him would change everything he believed about love, healing, and what it really meant to be a family. The next morning came quiet and gray. Clouds hung low over Texas, and rain pressed softly against the tall glass windows of the Coleman mansion. The storm hadn't started yet, but the sky looked ready to cry. David sat alone at the dining table, staring at a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He hadn't slept much, maybe an hour or two. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that word again, "Mommy." It circled his thoughts like a whisper he couldn't shut out. The house staff moved carefully around him, trying not to make any noise. They had learned that silence was safest when the boss was thinking. But this time, David wasn't angry. He was confused. Lost? He looked down at his cup again. His reflection stared back, tired and pale. He could still see the image from yesterday in his head, Grace kneeling on the floor, the twins moving their lips, their little eyes alive for the first time. He had seen miracles in movies, but never in his own home. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. Grace walked in carrying a tray of folded towels. Her black and white uniform was neat, her hair tied back, her yellow gloves tucked into her apron. She looked calm, as always. "Good morning, sir," she said quietly. He looked up slowly, his voice rough. "Grace, can I speak to you for a moment?" She stopped beside the table, holding the tray close to her chest. "Of course, sir." He motioned for her to sit, but she didn't. She stood straight, hands together, eyes respectful but calm. He studied her for a long time before speaking. "I saw what happened yesterday," he said, his tone low. "I heard them speak." Grace didn't look surprised. She nodded slightly. "Yes, sir." He leaned forward, trying to understand. "Both of them said, Mommy. How did you make them do that?" Grace lowered her eyes for a moment, her voice steady when she spoke. "I didn't make them, sir. They just did." David frowned. "No, that's not possible. You must have done something. You were singing, talking, something special. My sons haven't said a word in 2 years. The best doctors in Texas couldn't make that happen. Tell me what you did." She lifted her gaze to him, her eyes calm but full of quiet strength. "I talk to them every day, sir. I read to them, I sing, I hold their hands when they're scared. Maybe they finally felt safe enough to answer." David's fingers tightened around his cup. "Safe," he repeated softly, like the word tasted strange in his mouth. He looked down, shaking his head. You think that's all it takes? Safety? After all the therapy, the training, the equipment, you're saying they just needed to feel safe? Grace didn't argue. Her tone stayed soft. Sometimes that's all a child needs, sir. Someone who doesn't give up on them. Her words hung in the air like the quiet after a storm. David looked at her for a long moment. He didn't know what to feel: anger, shame, disbelief. The rain outside started tapping against the windows, filling the silence between them. Finally, he stood. You were hired to clean, not to teach. Don't do anything with my children unless I say so. Grace nodded, keeping her eyes low. Yes, sir. She picked up her tray and left the room quietly. David didn't move. He watched her until she disappeared down the hallway. Her calm voice, her steady tone, they kept echoing in his mind. Someone who doesn't give up on them. He sat down again, staring at the cold coffee. The words repeated in his head until they started to sting. He had never given up on his sons, had he? He had done everything money could buy. But as he thought deeper, a bitter truth came to him. Maybe he hadn't given up, but he had stepped back. He had left the healing to strangers while hiding in work and grief. He had given them comfort, but not warmth. He pushed the cup away and went to his office. The large digital clock on the wall read 9:47 a.m., but it already felt like noon. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop. Files filled the screen: medical reports, therapy schedules, and test results he had read 1,000 times. He scrolled through the same words that had become his prison. Severe motor impairment. Nonverbal. Low cognitive response. He leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands. They said you'd never speak, he whispered to himself. And now, you call someone else mommy. The ache in his chest grew heavier. He didn't know if it was pain or guilt anymore. Hours passed before he decided what to do next. He wanted to see it with his own eyes again, to prove to himself that what he had heard yesterday wasn't just his imagination. By afternoon, he called one of the nurses. Bring Ethan and Noah to the playroom, he said. I want to see them. A few minutes later, the nurse rolled the boys in, each sitting in a small support chair. Their little heads turned slowly, eyes drifting across the room. David crouched down in front of them, his voice careful. Hi, boys, Daddy's here. They didn't respond. Their eyes didn't follow him. He tried again, softer. Can you hear me? Nothing. He reached out and touched Ethan's small hand. It was warm, soft, but the boy didn't move. They've been quiet all morning, sir, the nurse said behind him. Grace usually stays with them during the mornings, but she's cleaning the west wing today. David hesitated. The words came out before he could stop them. Call her here. The nurse blinked, surprised. Yes, sir. Minutes later, Grace appeared at the doorway. Her uniform was damp from cleaning, her yellow gloves tucked into her apron. She stepped in carefully, her eyes lowering in respect. When Ethan saw her, something changed. His fingers twitched slightly on the chair's armrest. Noah's head turned toward her voice even before she spoke. Grace smiled gently and knelt beside them. Hey, baby, she said softly. The twins blinked, then smiled faintly. Their lips moved, forming shapes that almost looked like words. David's heart started to pound. Did you see that? He asked the nurse quietly. The nurse nodded. They never do that for anyone else, sir. Grace began to hum a soft tune, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan made a small sound in his throat, almost like he was trying to copy her. Noah's hand reached out just a little, his fingers stretching toward her. David stared, unable to speak. Grace looked up at him, her tone calm. See, sir, they can respond. They just need time, not pressure. He swallowed hard. You can stay with them for the rest of the afternoon, he said quietly. She nodded. Yes, sir. He turned and walked out slowly, but when he reached the doorway, he stopped. He looked back once more. Grace was sitting on the floor between the boys, humming while they watched her with peaceful eyes. The sound of that tune filled the room like a soft prayer. For a long moment, David didn't move. He finally understood something he had missed for years. His sons didn't need another doctor that day. They just needed someone who saw them. The next day arrived with a heavy sky hanging over Texas. The sun stayed hidden behind thick gray clouds, and the air smelled of rain. Inside the Coleman mansion, everything was still, but David could not rest. He had not gone to his company office that morning. Work didn't matter now. He had spent most of the night thinking about what he saw in the playroom. The way Ethan and Noah looked at Grace kept flashing through his mind. They had moved for her, smiled for her, even tried to speak. For 2 long years, they had done nothing but stare blankly at the walls. Now they were alive again, and it made no sense. He needed to understand. He walked through the quiet halls, each step slow and careful. The sound of his shoes echoed softly on the polished floor. The house felt different now, as if the walls were listening. He passed the portraits of his ancestors, each painted face reminding him of a family that once knew laughter. When he reached the nursery, the door was slightly open. A soft voice floated through the crack, a gentle humming sound. It was Grace. He stopped. Her voice was low and calm, like she was singing to the world itself. He pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Grace was sitting cross-legged on the carpeted floor, both boys resting beside her. The curtains were open wide, letting in soft daylight from the cloudy sky. She was rubbing lotion into the twins' arms carefully, her movements slow and full of love. And then he froze. He knew that song. It wasn't from any cartoon, show, or children's book. It was something older, something buried deep in his memory. His wife, Sarah, used to hum that same melody every night while she was pregnant. He remembered her voice in their bedroom, whispering words that didn't exist in any songbook. It hit him like a wave he wasn't ready for. He stepped inside quietly, trying not to startle her. "Where did you hear that?" he asked softly. Grace turned around quickly, surprised but not scared. "Oh, sir, I didn't know you were there," she said, her tone gentle. He walked closer, his voice shaking slightly. "That song you're singing, where did you learn it?" Grace hesitated. Her hands paused over the twins' blankets. She looked down for a moment, then reached for a small brown notebook lying beside her. The cover was worn, the corners bent. She held it out to him. "I found this," she said quietly, "behind one of the nursery shelves. I think it belonged to your wife." David stared at it. His hands trembled as he took it from her. The handwriting on the first page stopped his breath. It was Sarah's. The blue ink, the way the letters leaned slightly to the right, it was her, without a doubt. He flipped through the pages slowly. There were small notes about baby care, bedtime routines, and even a few hand-drawn hearts. Near the middle, he found it, a list of lullabies. And at the top of one page were the same words Grace had been singing. Above it, Sarah had written in her soft handwriting, "For when I'm not there." David's chest felt tight. The room blurred as his eyes filled with tears he couldn't stop. "You found this here?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Grace nodded. "Yes, sir. I thought maybe the boys would like to hear their mother's song. I didn't mean to overstep." He shook his head slowly, his voice low and rough. "No, you didn't overstep." He stared at the page again, then whispered, "You did what I should have done." Grace gave a small smile, gentle and kind. She looked back at the twins. "They love this one. Every time I sing it, they try to move their mouths with me. I think they know it somehow." David knelt down beside them, his knees touching the soft rug. He looked at Ethan's face, then at Noah's. They were both calm, their eyes half closed, listening to Grace's voice. When he reached out and touched Ethan's tiny hand, the boy didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his head toward his father. A small sound came out of Ethan's lips. It wasn't clear, it wasn't a full word, but it was a sound that came from life. David's body froze, his lips parted as he whispered, "What was that?" Grace smiled softly. "He's trying to talk, sir," she said. "He's been practicing little sounds when I read to them. I think he's getting stronger." David swallowed hard. His throat felt dry and heavy. For years, he had waited to hear his sons make a sound, any sound. Now it was happening, and he didn't know how to react. He stood up slowly, his heart full and confused all at once. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Every doctor told me there was no hope. Every report said the same thing." Grace spoke gently, her voice steady but full of truth. "Hope doesn't die, sir. People just stop listening to it." David looked at her for a long time. Her eyes held no pride, no show of victory, just calm honesty. It made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. That night, he couldn't bring himself to leave the nursery. After dinner, he came back quietly, standing outside the door. Through the small crack, he could see Grace again, sitting on the floor with a book in her hand. The twins were lying on the rug beside her, their eyes following every move she made. She was reading from a small children's story, her voice soft and patient. After each line, she paused, waiting, giving them time to listen and react. "It's okay, baby," she said after a pause. "You can say it, you can try." David leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, not in anger but in emotion he couldn't explain. His eyes were wet again. He listened quietly, every word soaking into his heart. When the story ended, Grace began to hum again. It was that same gentle lullaby from Sarah's notebook. The melody floated through the air like a soft memory of love that never died. David closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "Sarah, if you can see this, she's doing what I couldn't." He stood there for a long time, watching her from the shadows. The room glowed softly from the lamp, and everything in it felt warm again. When Grace finished the song, she picked up her own small notebook and started writing something down, probably notes from the day, maybe things the boys did. David didn't go inside. He didn't want to break the peace. He turned quietly and walked back down the hall. When he reached his study, he sat behind his desk and opened Sarah's old notebook again. He turned the pages slowly, his fingers trembling. Each word she wrote felt like she was speaking through time. At the bottom of one page, he found a line that made him stop breathing. "If anything ever happens to me, remind them that love can still reach them, even when words cannot." David closed the notebook gently and sat in silence. For years, he had tried to fix everything with science, control, and money. But now he understood. Sarah had known all along. Love was the only medicine that never ran out. He leaned back in his chair, tears rolling down his face as he whispered into the quiet room, "Thank you, Grace." Even though she couldn't hear him, he meant every word. That night, when he finally went to bed, the silence in the house no longer felt empty. It felt alive. The air outside grew darker that evening, heavy with the smell of rain. Thick clouds rolled over the wide Texas sky, and the sound of distant thunder moved across the hills. Inside the Coleman mansion, the lights flickered softly, glowing against the storm that waited outside. Grace had stayed later than usual. The twins had been restless all afternoon, turning their heads and making small sounds as if they were looking for something they couldn't name. David noticed it too. Every time Grace entered the room, they became calm again. Every time she left, they grew uneasy. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched from a distance, standing in the doorway of the nursery while Grace adjusted their blankets. The twins followed her with their eyes, their small fingers twitching as she moved. "The thunder is scaring them a little," she said softly without turning around. David nodded. "It's fine," he said quietly. "They seem to trust you." Grace looked down at the twins and smiled faintly. "Children always know when someone truly sees them," she said. Her words hung in the air for a moment. David didn't know how to respond. He just kept watching her, his thoughts full of questions he couldn't form. After a long pause, he said, "I want to stay with them tonight." Grace turned, a little surprised. "That would mean a lot to them, sir," she said softly. The storm outside began to rumble louder. A bright flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed by the low growl of thunder. The twins flinched, their tiny hands trembling under the blankets. David moved closer to their cribs, pulling a chair beside them. "It's okay, boys," he whispered, his voice unsure. "Daddy's here." Grace sat on the floor beside him, her presence calm and steady. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The room filled with the sounds of the rain hitting the windows and the soft hum of wind through the trees. Then Grace began to hum. It was that same gentle song, the one from Sarah's notebook. The same one David had heard his wife sing years ago when she was alive. The melody floated softly through the room, blending with the rhythm of the rain. Ethan stirred in his crib. His lips moved slightly, a small sound slipping out. Grace stopped humming and looked at him carefully. "It's okay, baby," she said softly. "You can say it." David leaned forward, his heart tight, his breath held still. Another flash of lightning filled the room with white light. The thunder followed, shaking the window frames. Then it happened. "Sin," Ethan whispered. The sound was faint, broken but clear. Grace covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. "He tried to say my name," she whispered. Before David could speak, Noah moved next. His lips trembled, his face strained as if pulling from deep inside. "Sin," he breathed out, the same broken sound. David froze. For a moment, time stopped. The thunder outside, the rain, even the air seemed to hold still. Both of his sons had spoken again. But this time, they said the name of the woman who had brought them back to life. Grace's eyes stayed on the twins, her voice trembling. "It's not full words yet, sir," she said softly, "but it's trust. That's where speaking begins." David's chest felt heavy, like something inside him was breaking and healing at the same time. He looked at her, his voice shaking. "They spoke for you," he said quietly. "They only respond to you." Grace wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "They'll respond to you too, sir," she said gently. "You just have to reach first." Her words hit him hard. For a long moment, he couldn't move. Then slowly, he stood and walked to Ethan's crib. His hand trembled as he placed it gently on his son's back. The boy didn't pull away. His small body was warm under the blanket. David bent closer, whispering, "Daddy's here, son." Ethan turned his head slightly. His mouth opened. A soft sound came out, not clear, but real. Grace smiled through her tears. "See," she said quietly, "he knows your voice." David's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He had waited 2 years to hear even a single sound from his sons. Now both had spoken, and it had nothing to do with medicine or therapy. It came from something simple: love. The storm outside grew louder for a while, thunder rolling like waves, lightning painting the room in flashes of white and gold. But inside the nursery, the world was calm. Grace sat beside him, still humming that same lullaby. The twins slowly closed their eyes, their breathing steady. When the thunder began to fade, David looked at Grace again. Her face was soft, the lamplight glowing on her skin. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also peace. She had done something no one else could do. "You should rest," she said quietly. "They'll sleep soon." David shook his head. "No, I'll stay." Grace nodded and didn't argue. She stood up, pulled a blanket tighter around the twins, then walked to the window. Outside, the storm had started to pass. The clouds were breaking, and patches of stars were starting to appear through the dark. She sat near the window, the faint light touching her face. For a long time, they both stayed silent. The only sounds were the soft breaths of the boys and the dripping rain outside. Finally, David spoke. His voice was low, uncertain. "Grace, can I ask you something?" She looked up. "Of course, sir." He hesitated. "Why do you care so much about them? You could have left after the first week. Most people would have." Grace looked down, her fingers playing with the edge of her apron. "Because I know what it's like to feel forgotten," she said softly. David didn't speak. "When I was little," she continued, "my mother was a maid too. She worked for a family that never looked at her, not once. I used to sit outside her job, waiting for her to finish, hoping she'd come out early. She never did. She worked too hard, trying to keep me fed. I remember asking her once why she never complained, and she said, 'Baby, love is what we give, not what we get.'" Her voice trembled slightly. "When I look at your boys, I see that same emptiness I used to feel as a child, waiting for someone to show up. So, I show up." The room fell silent again. The rain had stopped completely. The house, for once, didn't feel cold. David looked at her, his throat tight. "Thank you, Grace," he said quietly. "You've done more for them than anyone ever could." Grace shook her head gently. "It's not me, sir. It's love. I just gave it room to breathe." David didn't reply. He looked at the twins again. They were asleep now, their faces peaceful, their hands resting together between the blankets. Something inside him changed in that moment. For 2 years, he had tried to control everything, afraid to feel again. But watching Grace, he realized that love didn't need control, it only needed courage. He stayed in the nursery that night, sitting quietly beside the cribs until morning. When the first light of dawn touched the windows, he looked at his sons, then at Grace by the window. And for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The morning sun broke through the clouds, spreading warm light across the Coleman mansion. The smell of rain still hung in the air, but the world outside looked fresh, alive, and new. Birds sang softly from the oak trees near the garden, and the wind carried the scent of wet grass through the open windows. Grace walked quietly down the hallway, holding a stack of folded blankets in her hands. Her steps were light, her heart calm. Something had changed in the house since the night of the storm. The air felt different, softer, and for the first time since she started working there, the silence didn't feel heavy. When she entered the nursery, she stopped for a moment, smiling. David was sitting on the floor between the two cribs. His hair was messy, his eyes tired, but there was peace on his face. Ethan and Noah were both awake, lying on their backs, their eyes bright and full of life. "Good morning, sir," Grace said softly. David turned and smiled faintly. "Good morning, Grace," he said. His voice was warm now, no longer distant. "They didn't sleep much, but I didn't mind." He reached into one of the cribs and touched Ethan's hand. The boy smiled, a small but real smile. Noah followed with a soft laugh, short and broken, but it filled the room like sunlight. Grace set the blankets down and walked closer. "They look happy," she said gently. "They are," David replied. They kept trying to make small sounds during the night, little ones, but real. Grace knelt beside him, her eyes soft. She leaned close to the twins and said, "Good morning, my babies. Did you sleep well?" Both boys blinked, their lips moving. Ethan made a tiny sound that almost sounded like a laugh. Noah's mouth opened slightly, and a faint word came out, barely clear but full of meaning. "Mommy." David's eyes widened slightly, but this time there was no pain. He looked at Grace, then at his sons, and instead of sadness, he felt peace. "They love you," he said quietly. Grace looked down at the boys, then at him. "They love you too, sir. They just needed to remember what love feels like." David's eyes grew wet, but he didn't look away. "You brought them back to me," he said, his voice shaking. Grace smiled gently. "No, sir. I just reminded them that love was still here." The room fell quiet again, but it was a beautiful kind of silence, the kind that carried peace, not pain. The morning breeze slipped through the window, touching the curtains, and the sunlight painted soft gold across the floor. David watched Grace for a moment, thinking of how much had changed in such a short time. Then he said softly, "Grace, there's something I need to show you." She looked at him, puzzled. "Sir?" He stood and walked to the small table near the window. On it lay a white envelope with her name written neatly across the front. He picked it up and handed it to her. "It came yesterday," he said. "It's from a therapy center in Dallas. They want to hire you." Grace blinked, confused. "For me?" "Yes," David said. "They saw one of your reports the nurse sent. They said you have a gift for working with children." She held the envelope in her hands, staring at it. "I didn't apply anywhere," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "But they found you anyway." She didn't open it. She looked at the twins instead. They were watching her quietly, their small fingers moving as if they could feel her hesitation. "I don't know if I should go," she said after a moment. David looked at her carefully. "Why not?" She looked at the boys again. "Because they're not ready for me to leave. And maybe," she paused, "I'm not ready to leave them either." Her words filled the room with silence again, but this time It was full of meaning. David understood it deeply. He stepped closer, his tone low and sincere. "If you stay," he said, "I don't want you to stay as just help. I want you to stay as part of this family." Grace looked up slowly, surprised. "Sir!" He shook his head gently. "You've done more for my sons than anyone else ever could. You gave them their first word, their first smile, and their first peace. I can't pay that back with money. I just want you to know that you belong here if you choose to." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "That means more than you know." She looked back at the twins, her voice trembling. "What do you think, my babies?" she asked with a soft smile. "Should I stay?" Ethan made a tiny sound. Then Noah followed. Both of them reached their little arms toward her at the same time. She laughed softly through her tears. "I guess that's my answer." The moment felt sacred. The two children who once lived in silence were now reaching for the woman who gave them their voices. David stood there, watching the scene, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: gratitude. Later that afternoon, the papers were signed. It was a simple agreement. Grace would stay as a permanent caregiver and guardian to the twins. She would live in the family wing of the house. There were no conditions, no strict rules, only trust. When she signed her name, she looked up and said quietly, "I never thought my life would bring me here, sir." David smiled softly. "Neither did I, Grace." Days turned into weeks, and the house changed more each day. The halls that once echoed with silence now carried laughter. The toys that were once locked away filled the living room. The staff smiled more. The house no longer felt like a museum, it felt like a home. One warm afternoon, David came home early from work. As he stepped out of his car, he heard laughter coming from the garden. The sound was faint, but full of life. He followed it quietly and stopped near the swing set. Grace was sitting on the bench, watching Ethan and Noah. The twins sat side by side on the swing, their hands gripping the ropes while Grace gently pushed them forward. Their laughter was clumsy, uneven, but real. David stood there for a while, his chest full of emotion. Then he walked closer and said softly, "They sound happy." Grace turned her head and smiled at him. "They are, sir. They finally found their world again." He nodded, his voice low. "And so did I." The twins saw him and began waving their hands excitedly. Their laughter grew louder, echoing through the garden. David joined them, placing his hands on the swing ropes and pushing gently. The three of them moved together, slow and steady. Grace stood behind them, watching with a full heart. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The light touched their faces, warm and peaceful. For a long time, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The sound of laughter said everything. The house that once knew only silence was now alive again. And for the first time in years, David Coleman finally understood what it meant to be whole. Dear viewers, this story reminds us that love can do what money never can. Grace was not a doctor or a therapist. She was a humble woman with a heart full of compassion. Through that heart, she brought two silent children back to life and healed a man who had forgotten what it meant to feel. No matter where we come from or what we've lost, love still has the power to reach us, even when words cannot. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more real and emotional stories that remind us of the strength of kindness.